On the clear moonlit night of November 7, 1837, a mob surrounded a warehouse at Alton, Illinois, intent on destroying an anti-slavery newspaper run by the Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy. When one of the mob moved to set the building on fire, Lovejoy, armed with a pistol, came out to stop him. The slavery men shot him dead and dumped his printing press into the Mississippi. The news stunned the nation. A white man had been killed over black slavery. Protest meetings were held throughout the North. One abolitionist wrote that thousands of our citizens who lately believed that they had nothing to do with slavery now begin to discover their error. Ohio, a clergyman told a church gathering, "The question now before us is no longer, can slaves be made free, but are we free, or are we slaves under mob law?" In the back of the church, a strange, gaunt man rose to his feet and raised his right hand.
Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. John Brown.
In 1846, a lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, was elected to Congress. He was born in Kentucky, the son of a farmer who could barely sign his name. He became a legislator at 24, a prosperous attorney, and after a turbulent courtship, the husband of Miss Mary Todd, the daughter of a slave-holding Kentucky banker. For Abraham Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence was to be taken literally. All men had the right to rise as far as talent would take them, just as he had. He detested slavery, but he called for its restriction, not immediate abolition. By mid-century, the country was deeply divided. Southerners feared the North might forbid slavery. Northerners feared slavery might move west. As each new state was added to the Union, it threatened to upset the delicate equilibrium of power.
There are grave doubts at the hugeness of the land, and whether one government can comprehend the whole. Henry Adams.
Now events accelerated. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Its portrayal of slavery's cruelty moved readers as nothing else had. Queen Victoria wept over it, and within a year, more than 1.5 million copies were in print worldwide. In 1854, Congress allowed settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide for themselves whether or not to permit slavery. Kansas exploded. 5,000 pro-slavery men invaded the territory. In the next 3 months, 200 men died in bleeding Kansas. The killing would not stop for 10 years. In 1857, the Supreme Court refused to free a slave, Dred Scott, even though he had lived for many years on free soil. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect.
As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Abraham Lincoln.
Violence reached the floor of the United States Senate, where Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina savagely beat abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner with his cane. Southern sympathizers sent Brooks new canes. Members began carrying knives and pistols into the chamber. Meanwhile, the nation's chief executive, James Buchanan, did nothing.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other.
On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led 5 blacks and 13 whites into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He brought along a wagon load of guns to arm the slaves he was sure would rally to him. Once they had, he planned to lead them southward along the crest of the Appalachians and destroy slavery. Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times in 6 states and defaulted on his debts. Yet he believed himself God's agent on earth. In 1856, at Pottawatomie, Kansas, he and his sons had hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, all in the name of defeating Satan and his legions. Brown and his men quietly seized the armory, arsenal, and engine house and took up hostages, including George Washington's great-grandnephew. After that, nothing went right. The first person killed was the town baggage master, a free black. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did. The first of Brown's followers to fall was Dangerfield Newby, a former slave. Someone in the crowd cut off his ears as souvenirs. On Tuesday morning, federal troops arrived from Washington, led by a U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee. Lee's men stormed the engine house, and 9 more of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown, severely wounded, was turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason.
In firing his gun, John Brown has merely told what time of day it is. It is high noon. Thank God. William Lloyd Garrison.
An undivided South says, let him hang. Albany, Georgia Patriot.
Virginia found Brown guilty and sentenced him to death. Among the troops at the scene of his hanging were cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, led by an eccentric professor, Thomas J. Jackson. Also there was a private in the Richmond Greys, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth.
December 2nd, 1859. Old John Brown has been executed for treason against a state. We cannot object, even though he agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. That cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. It could avail him nothing that he might think himself right. Abraham Lincoln.
Ralph Waldo Emerson likened Brown to Christ. Nathaniel Hawthorne declared, "No man ever more justly hanged." And Herman Melville called him the meteor of the war. Brown had said nothing from the gallows, but he did hand one of his guards a note.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.